The Geneva Conference Hall swelled with global importance, not as a beginning, but as a continuation of what had already been unfolding across earlier summits, where truths once whispered were now breaking into the open. The chandeliers glared down upon diplomats, journalists, and leaders who had grown used to polite evasions. But this time the air was heavier, more charged, as if everyone sensed that what would be spoken here would ripple far beyond the polished floors. Cameras panned across stern faces, catching the restless twitch of pens tapping paper, the tightening of jaws, the slight shifting in seats that betrayed unease. Then Adam Schiff leaned forward, his voice sharp, his smirk deliberate, cutting through the murmurs with a single line designed not just to sting, but to diminish. "Some here wonder," he said slowly, letting the pause stretch, "how a man with so little formal education can sit among us to discuss matters of global policy." The silence that followed hit the room like glass shattering. Eyes darted. Nervously, whispers rose like smoke at the edges, and yet all attention converged on a single figure seated calmly at the center. The cameras zoomed in on Ibrahim Traoré's face. He did not move. Not a twitch of the lip, not a blink of the eye. His stillness unsettled the hall far more than any outburst could have. Schiff, expecting an angry protest or defensive posture, received instead a silence so heavy it felt like thunder gathering in the distance. The audience, unsettled, waited. Some leaned forward, others drew back as if bracing for a storm. The moderator half extended a hand toward the microphone, but froze, sensing the moment did not belong to him. The weight of humiliation hung in the air, yet Traoré did not claim it. Instead, he seemed to transform it into something larger, something unspoken but undeniable. He reached for a glass of water, movements deliberate, his hands steady as if guided by unseen rhythm. He lifted it, took a slow sip, and then set it down with a quiet finality that echoed louder than Schiff's insult. His lips curved into the faintest of smiles. The audience froze. The silence deepened. What came next, they knew instinctively, would not be ordinary. And then he spoke, his voice soft but carrying across the chamber like a bell ringing through a valley. "Education is not only what is written on paper," he said, each word unhurried, yet sharp enough to pierce the stillness. "A degree can teach facts, but life teaches truth." His words hung suspended in the air, and suddenly, the insult that had been designed to belittle shifted, reversing its weight, reflecting back upon the one who had spoken it. The cameras stayed fixed on him, capturing not just his expression, but the aura of composure that radiated from him. Schiff shifted in his seat, caught off guard by the calmness he could neither mock nor dismiss. The room remained breathless, every heartbeat attuned to the unspoken sense that this was no mere exchange, but the beginning of something irreversible. In that silence, the tide began to turn, though no one could yet name how. The silence that had settled after his first words did not break into applause, nor into chatter, but into something heavier, an attentiveness that made every eye in the hall feel as though it was holding its breath. Traoré let the pause linger, and when he finally continued, his voice carried the weight of distant memories, pulling the room back with him. He spoke of his mother walking miles to fetch water, of her body collapsing beneath the unbearable weight, and of himself, barefoot, hungry, a boy of 12, lifting that container onto his own head and carrying it home. The image unfolded in the minds of those present. A child against the endless horizon, dust clinging to his legs, determination stronger than his thin frame should have allowed. Schiff shifted in his chair, uneasy, the smirk he had once worn, now flickering under the press of a story that stripped away the distance between privilege and struggle. Traoré's voice did not rise, but its steadiness cut deeper than any shout. He described makeshift classrooms beneath trees, no blackboards, no books. And yet from those places emerged doctors, engineers, soldiers, men and women who carried nations on their backs. "Tell me," he asked quietly, not looking at Schiff, alone but sweeping his gaze across the hall. "Who is uneducated? The one who studies from the soil, or the one who forgets the meaning of humanity despite all his diplomas?" The words, though gentle, cracked through the chamber like stone on glass. A few diplomats lowered their eyes. Cameras panned to capture expressions, some teary, some ashamed, some frozen. Schiff tugged at his papers, but the sound of rustling only deepened the silence, making him appear smaller, exposed. The story widened. Traoré spoke of a boy named Musa, a friend from his village whose mind was sharper, whose memory was quicker, whose dreams stretched far beyond their dusty classroom. Musa, he said, could have become anything: scholar, inventor, leader. But poverty had other plans. Forced to abandon school, Musa carried bricks by 15, his back breaking before his spirit ever could. 2 years later, he collapsed at a construction site and never rose again. A ripple of grief seemed to move through the hall. Some gasped softly, others blinked against tears they did not want seen. Schiff's eyes flickered, but avoided Traoré's gaze. The narrative had shifted from a personal insult to something vaster, heavier, a catalogue of lives lost not by ignorance but by the world's indifference. Narration painted the contrast: institutions cloaked in arrogance, their walls polished by privilege, dismissing children whose hunger gnawed louder than their lessons, who fainted mid-sentence not from stupidity but from empty stomachs. The whole became a mirror, forcing those present to see not the argument but the failure of systems. A diplomat, unable to contain himself, leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "He is not defending himself. He is defending us all." The microphone did not catch it, but the words seemed to reverberate anyway, carried on the air heavy with revelation. A few students in the back, their eyes shining, began to clap softly, timid at first, but swelling, spreading. The sound echoed, multiplied until thunder filled the chamber. Schiff froze, glancing around, realizing this was no longer about him against one man, but him against a rising truth. His arrogance faltered, stripped bare by stories spoken without malice yet weighted with undeniable authority. Traoré's words wove scars into lessons, wounds into chapters of a living textbook that no diploma could surpass. Each anecdote was not just memory but indictment. The poverty that crushed brilliance, the hunger that silenced futures, the scars borne by children who never had a chance to speak. Schiff sat rigid, but even he could not prevent the realization, forming in every corner of the room, that he was not witnessing a rebuttal, but a trial, and the conscience of humanity itself was the jury. The applause that had begun like a timid ripple now subsided into an almost unbearable stillness, as though the very air had thickened with the weight of stories no textbook had ever dared to hold. Traoré let the silence breathe before standing, his movements slow, deliberate, as if summoning every scar to bear witness. The cameras leaned closer, lenses hungry, capturing the slight roll of his sleeve as he exposed the mark carved deep into his arm. The hall gasped collectively, a sound more human than political, and Traoré's voice carried steady and unshaken. "This was my university. I was 18 when rebels came to my village. I had no diploma, no teacher, no shelter, only courage. This scar is my certificate, written in blood." The words echoed like thunder under stone ceilings. Schiff stared down at his notes, his smirk erased, his arrogance shriveled to silence. Traoré did not pause to gloat. Instead, he reached into his pocket and laid a small, faded cloth on the table before him. The cameras zoomed. The audience leaned forward. It was a torn fragment of the Burkina Faso flag. His tone lowered, trembling not from weakness but from memory. "This," he said, was cut from the coffin of a boy no older than 19. His mother pressed it into my hand and said, "Carry his sacrifice in your heart." This flag has taught me more than any classroom ever could. The chamber felt less like a summit now and more like a reckoning. Tears welled, hands covered mouths, and Schiff shifted again, sweat purling at his temple, papers trembling in his grip. Traoré's words sharpened, cutting without malice but with precision. "If being educated means forgetting the cries of the poor, then I pray I never have such an education." Gasps erupted. A diplomat's shoulders shook. A woman sobbed softly in the back row. Schiff's colleagues looked away, as though unwilling to witness his collapse. Traoré pressed forward, his tone unchanging, his calmness all the more devastating. He told of his father, buried by his own hands before dawn, gunfire still echoing from the night. He spoke of blistered feet marching without boots, of leading men on empty stomachs, of hunger heavier than rifles yet carried for the sake of children, who might never know his name. His voice did not rise, but his words climbed higher than any shout. "Do you know what it means?" he asked softly, locking his gaze on Schiff. "To lead soldiers when your own belly aches with nothing? To fight not for medals or degrees, but so one child can sleep without fear." The narration within the hall became unbearable to ignore. Faces streaked with tears, seasoned diplomats trembling, students sitting straighter as though carved into history. Schiff's collapse was no longer hidden, his brow damp, his gaze nailed to the floor, his fingers fumbling nervously at the edges of his notes. He was no longer a congressman commanding respect, but a man cornered by truth too immense to deflect. Cameras captured every tremor, every flicker of fear in his expression. Meanwhile, the calmness of Traoré only magnified the imbalance. Students rose in the back rows, clapping first with hesitation, then louder, until chants of his name filled the air like waves crashing on stone. Diplomats followed, clapping through their tears, their applause not just for a leader, but for the millions of silent voices he carried. Schiff sat pale, shrinking visibly, an artifact of arrogance dissolving before the world's eyes. By then, the confrontation was no longer a debate, no longer politics. It was a global trial, truth against pretense, humanity against pride. And the verdict had already been delivered. Schiff had lost. The roar of applause that had risen like a storm gradually softened, its echoes rolling through the vast chamber until only silence remained, a silence heavy with reverence rather than emptiness. Traoré stood unmoved at the center, his hands steady, his head bowed, not as a man claiming victory, but as one carrying the weight of sorrow that did not belong to him alone. Schiff remained hunched over his papers, pale and still, shrinking into irrelevance. His earlier arrogance now a shadow that clung weakly to a man who no longer commanded the room. The audience shifted slowly, some wiping their eyes, others simply staring at the leader from Burkina Faso as if they had just been forced to confront a truth larger than their own nations. The conference began to disperse, but no one left with the casual chatter of politics. Instead, they moved with hushed tones, diplomats exchanging glances not of strategy but of shame and awe. Journalists rushed to file their reports, pens scratching, fingers flying over keyboards, desperate to capture what had just unfolded before it slipped from memory. Students whispered among themselves, some murmuring prayers, others repeating fragments of Traoré's words as though committing them to scripture. Schiff lingered, hunched low, pulling out his phone in a futile attempt to escape into its glow. Notifications stung like arrows, headlines mocking him, viral clips showing his smirk evaporating in the face of dignity, commentary slicing through the last shreds of his defense. He scrolled and scrolled, yet the more he looked, the more his Arrogance unraveled into something unrecognizable, silence from allies, ridicule from strangers, and betrayal by the very cameras he once believed served him. Later, he would walk through hallways where colleagues avoided his eyes, where whispered laughter seemed sharper than open confrontation. At home, neighbors who once waved with shallow courtesy now turned away, unwilling to meet the gaze of a man whose name had become synonymous with humiliation. His daughter's messages, once vibrant, grew fewer, then stopped altogether, her silence heavier than any headline. His career slipped not with a dramatic fall, but with quiet erasure, each opportunity drying up, each door closing gently until only the memory of his arrogance remained to haunt him. Meanwhile, the words of Ibrahim Traoré lived on, no longer confined to the chamber that had first received them. Clips spread like wildfire, traveling from smartphones to news broadcasts, from dimly lit cafes to bustling marketplaces. In classrooms, his lines were repeated by teachers who saw in them a lesson no textbook had dared to teach. In small villages, his story was painted on walls, his quotes scribbled onto scraps of paper, recited by children who believed they, too, carried a fire inside that no certificate could measure. In capitals far away, officials rewatched the video in silence, knowing the world had shifted. And across the internet, strangers wept behind screens, writing messages not of pity, but of gratitude, sharing his voice like a torch passed from hand to hand. As the frenzy spread, one line lingered above the rest, quoted, echoed, engraved in memory. True education is not in the mind alone. It is in the heart that refuses to give up on its people. The line stood not as rhetoric, but as testimony, a sentence that stung long after the applause had faded. Schiff's defeat was complete, not because he had been shouted down, but because he had been erased by silence. Silence that came from the dignity of a man who never sought to humiliate, only to remind. The story did not close with noise or triumph, but with a quiet weight that clung to everyone who had heard it. It ended with the poetic justice of humility outlasting arrogance, of truth outliving insult, of dignity rising where pride had collapsed. And in that silence, the world knew it had been changed forever.